few creatures or characters that I, and I imagine many others, associate with the Halloween season as much as vampires. The story of Dracula and all the vampire depictions that were inspired by it is a mainstay in popular culture today, from the classic Universal monster movies, kids' movies, Halloween costumes, and much more. And while more recent depictions of vampires, such as in the Twilight movies, have maybe taken a turn away from its monstrous origins, vampires still remain quite frightening and chilling creatures. Undead, pale humans that will suck your blood for sustenance. But where do vampires actually come from? They become such a mainstay of popular culture that it's almost kind of weird to think that this might not have always been so. But what are the actual origins of vampires, and how have our ideas about vampires changed across the centuries? This is a spooky collaboration with my friend Dr. Justin Sledge over on the channel Esoterica, who's also going to be making some vampire-related content today, which you should definitely check out either before or after watching this video. It's always fun to do collaborations with such great friends and colleagues, and of course it's always Halloween season over there on Esoterica, so it was only fitting that I should do this collaboration with him in particular. And definitely go subscribe to his channel for more spooky and esoteric content. As is usually the case when we discuss topics like this, the question of the origins of the vampire depends very much on how we actually define the term vampire. For example, are vampires simply any supernatural blood-sucking creature? Well, then we can find examples of vampires all the way back in ancient times, since as long as we've had recorded history. An obvious example of that are the creatures of ancient Mesopotamia known as Lilitu, which were conceived as female demons or spirits that sometimes thirsted for blood or flesh, particularly that of babies and children. Not to mention that famous Mesopotamian demon Lamashtu that also devoured babies. The Mesopotamian Lilitu is also etymologically connected to the Hebrew Lilith, which appears in some sources as the first rebellious wife of Adam and as a dangerous demon. And there are equivalent creatures in other cultures, such as the Lamia in ancient Greece, which is also a scary creature or daimon that will eat children and haunt you during the night. There are also, of course, some real-life persons that later became associated with vampirism or vampire-like behavior. The obvious example is Vlad the Impaler, sometimes also known as Vlad Dracula, a powerful ruler of Wallachia and Romania who had a beef with the Ottomans and whose reputation became one of great cruelty. It is, of course, partly Vlad the Impaler that inspired Bram Stoker when he created the character of Dracula for the book of the same name in 1897. There is also the famous Hungarian noblewoman and alleged serial killer, Elizabeth Bathory. Later legends about her, although their accuracy is questionable, would tell how she bathed and showered in the blood of young virgins to retain her own youth. Witches and vampires are perhaps both connected with Halloween, but they are rarely combined as such today. that in history it was sometimes thought that witches also had vampiric tendencies by sucking the blood of their victims. The famous Christian esotericist and Platonist Marsilio Ficino wrote that, quote, "It is an ancient and common opinion that certain crones, called witches, suck the blood of infants in order to rejuvenate themselves as best they can. Then why might not our elderly, finding themselves all but without hope of survival, suck the blood of a lad? Of a lad, I say, of stalwart forces, healthy, cheerful, well-tempered, excellent blood that might by happy chance be excessive. Let them suck then like a leech, that is a bloodsucker, from a slightly open vein in the skinny part of the arm, an ounce or two, and immediately take the same amount of syrup or wine. This should be done precisely when they are hungry and thirsty and at the waxing of the moon." Another key characteristic of vampires is, of course, the contagious nature of their condition. They can turn others into vampires, often by sucking their blood. Keeping this aspect in mind, we can also find historical creatures such as the Dracula in Norse and Northern European folklore. In modern parlance, the Dracula is essentially a kind of zombie. The word basically means ghost, but Dracula is the physical body of a dead person that has come back to life for whatever reason. They are often very strong, dangerous, and can kill you through crushing or sometimes even by eating your flesh and indeed drinking your blood. And again, just like both vampires and zombies, if you fall victim to a Dracula, you can become one yourself. These are some of the most frightening and famous creatures from Scandinavian folklore and show up in pop culture such as in video games like Skyrim. Clearly then, the different features of the classic vampire has existed for a long time in different cultures, and the modern vampire is of course that is in some ways a combination of all these different myths and different aspects of folklore. But if we define the term more narrowly, and indeed I think it's pretty wise to do so in order to avoid leaving the term way too broad, if we define it as the kind of vampires that we know and love today, which is usually humans that have died and returned to life with a thirst for blood, that we don't have to go that far back in history. In fact, according to scholars like Nick Broom, the vampire is a creature that evolves in and as a result of a particular time and place, namely Europe in the early 18th century. Here, vampiric creatures of Eastern European folklore were picked up and developed in fascinating ways. Broom says that, quote, "Vampires came into being when Enlightenment rationality encountered East European folklore, an encounter that attempted to make sense of them through empirical reasoning, and that, by treating them as credible, gave them reality." Indeed, it is in Eastern Europe around this time that we see clear cases and examples of what we could recognize as something close to modern vampires. Already by the 17th century, we have really eerie accounts of so-called grave chewers. This phenomenon is just as grisly as it sounds. Apparently, some people that had died and been buried were later, when their coffins were opened, found to have eaten or consumed their own clothes or shrouds. The coffins would have been dug up and opened because the person was suspected of being a vampire, and very unsettlingly, there were reports that these individuals made noises from the grave. Standing over the grave hear the person grunting, gibbering, and squeaking from below the ground, probably as they were eating away. Some reports even say that these chewers had consumed parts of their own limbs. Now that is some spooky stuff. According to the Eastern European lore, these grave chewers, or vampires, would eventually also rise from their graves and visit and terrorize people they knew and liked. The particulars of the vampire lore can differ from place to place, but there are a few recurring features, aside from the ones already mentioned. Vampires were the reanimated corpse of a dead person, but despite the circumstances of death, or indeed having been dead for quite some time, the vampire's body and face somehow always seemed young, or at least healthy. Unlike modern vampires, it was usually thought that their faces were rosy red rather than corpse-like pale. The vampire would, as said, often visit loved ones of people they knew and liked. They could enter a home through any small crack and would attack people, sometimes through choking and often by sucking their blood. Again, distinctly from vampires as we know them, these vampires would usually suck blood from the chest, from a spot near the heart. Having thus attacked living people, the vampire would, so to say, infect that person, turning their victims into vampires themselves. But how did one protect oneself from a vampire in this context? Again, there are different conceptions, but some common ones include placing a crucifix or coin in the vampire's mouth, taking communion by the grave where the vampire lies, and making the sign of the cross. To kill a vampire, one could drive a nail through the forehead, so not through the chest or the heart as is common today, but a nail through the forehead. Then the vampire would be decapitated and the head would be placed between the 2 feet. The body of the vampire could then also be cremated or incinerated to just get rid of it completely. And we know that belief in vampires was widespread and with many different sightings at this time, precisely because we have so many reports of people actually digging up the graves of dead people and incinerating the corpses, and because they believed that these people were vampires. This was a real thing, which shows us that belief and worry about these creatures was very much real to many people at this time. It was these creatures that Western Europeans and Enlightenment-influenced people encountered in the early 18th century, and which, through this meeting, would turn into the vampire as we know it today, even though, of course, most of the pieces of the puzzle are already in place by this time. Indeed, in the early decades of the 1700s, we see what can only be described as a kind of epidemic of vampirism, with a whole host of famous and documented plain cases. One of the most famous early examples take place in Serbia in 1725, where a man named Peter Blagojevich has died, and after having been in the grave for 10 weeks, reportedly had risen from the dead. Over the course of 8 days, 9 people mysteriously died, most of them after being sick for only about 24 hours. The victims claimed that it was Peter Blagojevich that had visited them during the night, strangled them, and sucked their blood. As a result of this, locals and 2 public officials decided to exhume his body. They reported that the corpse was in a very strange condition. It gave off no smell, which is normal of a dead body, of course, and the body in general was surprisingly fresh. One of the public officials even reported that, quote, "Not without astonishment, I saw some fresh blood in his mouth." Blagojevich was then staked through the chest and then cremated. This is a really creepy and interesting case, and in news reports about it from that time, we find one of the earliest examples of the word vampire or vampiri being used to describe it. A few years later, we have another famous vampire case in Arnold Paoli, also in Serbia. A former soldier who had returned to his native village, Paoli had apparently had a run-in with a vampire while away and been infected with the disease. Officially, he died when a cart he was driving turned over, but many believe that the case was more supernatural. Whatever the case, 40 days after he died, 4 people were killed when he allegedly rose from his grave as a vampire himself, stalking his prey at night and being able to enter houses even through locked doors and barred windows. Similar to Blagojevich, as well as most other claimed vampire cases at that time, they dug him up and opened the coffin only to find his body in great shape, but drenched in blood. The most creepy part of this whole story is that allegedly, when they drove a stake through his heart, he apparently let out a shrieking noise. As usual, the body was then also cremated. And the 4 people that had been victims of Paoli was also dealt with in the same way, because, of course, they had been probably infected by the vampire disease. These are just 2 examples of many such cases in Europe at this time. There are many other cases which involve both women and children. Yes, there were vampire children even back then. This meeting between the traditional folklore of Eastern Europe with Enlightenment science is really important according to scholars and writers like me. Vampires have a certain scientific nature to them. They are not spirits or ghosts, but very physical, almost medical creatures. It is through a physical contamination of blood that the vampiric disease is transferred, a conception that developed in tandem with new theories and obsessions of the developing science at the time. Across the 18th century, we see many more reported cases of vampires, and the phenomena spreads to Western Europe and places like the UK. Plenty of literature appeared that tried to deal with this phenomenon. This was a major theological question issue for Christian thinkers, both Orthodox, Catholic, and Protestant, and there were various different approaches and attitudes toward it. Some people, Christian authorities included, were horrified by the exhumation of dead bodies, seeing it as sacrilegious and the whole vampire craze as pure superstition that led people to do horrible things to the sanctity of dead bodies. For others, it was a serious theological question that needed to be dealt with. While ghosts and other specters were more easily harmonized with Christian theology, vampires were a real question mark. Most Christians, of course, believed in some sort of afterlife, and things like ghosts and indeed vampires seemed to be a kind of confirmation or proof of this doctrine of the afterlife. While many Christian thinkers of various denominations were skeptical at the time, many others were not. Protestants in particular showed great interest in different kinds of ghosts as immaterial spectral phenomena, perhaps sent by God to convey messages. Vampires were a different story. Indeed, vampires are not immaterial. They they are very much physical. They are what is known as revenants, the reanimated physical corpse of a deceased human being. According to Christian theology, at least according to many interpretations, such a thing is indeed possible on very special occasions. After all, Jesus rose from the dead and himself brought Lazarus back to life in the Gospel stories. There is also the common idea in Christianity that the dead will be resurrected, including the body, according to many interpretations, at the end of time. So certainly the very fact that bodies could be raised from the dead existed in that wider thought world. But this was different, because only God is supposed to be able to perform such a miracle. And in the case of a vampire, that for sure isn't the work of God. Instead, the rising of a vampire was seen as the work of the devil himself. But the devil can't have that kind of power, only God is supposed to. So you can see that this would be a rather heated theological debate. And in general, although there are exceptions that we will see soon, Protestants were much less keen to accept the reality of vampires and to accept all these claims about vampiric activities, instead often being seen as a kind of Catholic superstition, according to the Protestants. The debates, in other words, were raging at this time. And remember, this was also the time of the Enlightenment, which meant that alongside these theological debates and intertwined with them were also naturalistic theories and explanations. Rationalists and theologians, who were often the same people too, tried to figure out where the vampire stood. Was it a natural biological phenomenon, or was it a supernatural one? Alternatively, did vampires actually exist at all, or just as illusions or hoaxes? Whatever the case, vampires were here to stay, and at this point the modern vampire had essentially already been born, at least in its basic features. Indeed, in 1733, the Protestant philosopher, theologian, and historian Johann Heinrich Zopf gives us a description of the vampire that feels right at home for most of us even today. Quote, "Vampires issue forth from their graves in the night, attack people sleeping quietly in their beds, suck out all their blood from their bodies, and destroy them. They beset men, women, and children alike, sparing neither age nor sex. Those who are under the fatal malignity of their influence complain of suffocation and the total deficiency of spirits, after which they soon expire. Some who, when at the point of death, have been asked if they can tell what is causing their disease, reply that such and such persons, lately dead, have risen from the tomb to torment and torture them." This trend of vampire literature that emerged in Europe is significant and, of course, helped solidify the creature in public consciousness in various different ways. It includes the incredibly titled De Masticatore Mortuorum Intromuris, or On Those That Chew Inside Their Graves, by the Lutheran writer Michael Bunft, among other such works. And it is precisely this early vampire literature that Dr. Justin Sledge will be focusing on in his companion video to this one. So be sure to check out that video if you want to know more about these earliest treatises and writings about vampires from different sources and people in the 18th century. Whatever the case, vampires were all the rage at this time. They were not only a prominent feature of Eastern European folklore, they were also highly heated theological question in the Christian churches, a natural curiosity to scientists and enlightened thinkers, and also at this time also started to become a prominent feature of Western European literature. Indeed, it was by the late 18th century, and especially for the remainder of the 19th century, that the vampire would really enter Western European consciousness and popular culture through its huge prominence in literature of different sorts. Even though by the late 18th century the so-called vampire epidemic had ended, and many scientists and even many Christian authorities had sort of denied the reality of vampires, that whole fear and craze of vampires sort of became less prominent. It sort of died out a little bit. It was in literature and pop culture that the vampire was really to thrive and survive in the decades and centuries going forward. The vampire became a prominent character in poems like The Vampire by Heinrich August Ossenfelder, or in The Braut von Corinth, The Bride of Corinth by Goethe, and it also emerged as an important aspect of English literature, particularly in the literary movement of Gothic fiction or Romanticism, which emerged as a response to the dry rationalism of the Enlightenment to highlight things like strong emotions, individualism, and romanticism of the past. Here, vampires became one of the key features of the Gothic aesthetic, which dominated literature and art for much of the 19th century. This is the literary movement that also gave us classics like Mary Shelley's Frankenstein. And when it comes to the vampire, this is perhaps best exemplified by the 1819 story, The Vampire, written by John William Polidori. This work is often considered the first and most influential example of vampire fiction, at least until a certain book by the end of that century, whose depiction of the creature would have lasting effects until this very day. In this story, the vampire in question is Lord Ruthven, an aristocratic gentleman who just so happens to be a monster that sucks the blood of his victims. Through Polidori's The Vampire, many classic features of vampire fiction were established for the first time, at least in a comprehensive, systematic way. The vampire primarily seeks out young, beautiful women and gets nourishment from their youthful innocence and often virginity. In other words, in literature, the vampire was transformed in various ways. As Paul Barber puts it, quote, I have found it necessary to distinguish repeatedly between the fictional and the folkloric vampire. The former sucks blood from the neck of the victim, for example, while the other, when he sucks blood at all, attacks the chest area of the victim in the vicinity of the heart, with only rare exceptions. The fictional vampire tends to be tall, thin, and sallow. The folkloric vampire is plump and ruddy or dark in color. The two would be unlikely to meet socially, and the fictional vampire tends to spring from the nobility and to live in a castle, while the folkloric vampire is of peasant stock and resides, during the day at least, in the graveyard in which he was buried. And this would set the stage for the vampire's popularity and prominence in Romance Gothic literature during the 19th century. From the classic and epic Penny Dreadful serial Varney the Vampire, that ran from 1845 to 1847 and became immensely popular, introducing new tropes such as the vampire having sharp, fang-like teeth for the first time, to the 1872 Irish novella Carmela, depicting a female vampire that preys upon the also female main protagonist, but by far the most famous and important and influential piece of vampire fiction in history is Bram Stoker's novel Dracula. Released in 1897, right at the end of the 19th century, this would become the most decisive factor in the continuing popularity of vampires in public consciousness. In many ways, summarizing all vampire lore from previous centuries and, with innovations of its own, of course, positively defined what vampires were to be from that moment on. Stoker's novel is a frightening gothic tale told in a really unique form through things like diary entries, letters, and journals, kind of making it the equivalent of a found footage horror film today. It begins with the solicitor Jonathan Harker, who travels to Transylvania to meet the titular Count Dracula in order to help him in purchasing a house in London for his business ventures. Quickly, though, Harker's stay in the castle turns nightmarish as it slowly becomes clear that the Count is a blood-sucking monster. The story then continues in England, where Dracula continues to terrorize the population, sucking their blood, killing them, and turning them into vampires in turn. There is a lot going on in this novel, and Stoker establishes many of the tropes that we have come to associate with vampires today through his terrifying titular character. Among them, the idea that vampires can turn into bats, for example. This is very much from Dracula, not part of folklore from before. Somewhat similar to Polydorus the vampire, Count Dracula is a well-spoken man of royal blood, and this contrast makes his monstrous side all the more frightening. At the same time, the Count is from Romania, partly inspired by the historical figure Vlad Dracula, and there are many social and political themes at play here too. The general attitude of people in England toward people from Eastern Europe or Turkey or the Ottoman Empire generally was not that positive, to say the least, at this time. And literally the idea that there's a blood-sucking vampire from Romania that comes to England to suck the blood of its inhabitants clearly has political and social themes involving xenophobia, for instance. Whether or not that was intentional on Stoker's part, or simply just part of the environment at the time and the sort of general zeitgeist, so to say. There's no denying how riveting and spooky the book is, and it of course became a huge success in several ways. It really is the quintessential vampire novel, one which still reverberates today. Broom writes, quote, Dracula is the climax to over 70 years of vampire tales, themselves predated by and predating upon a further century of attested reports, reasoned theories, and systematic debates. And although in its wake Dracula would be restlessly reworked in thousands of ways, not only in literature but also on the big screen and on the small screen, on the stage and on the catwalk, as well as by late 20th century goths and early 21st century emos, the novel remains a remarkable document of state-of-the-art 1890s vampirology. Drawing on the past, Stoker defined the vampire for the future, and Count Dracula became the vampire par excellence. But that isn't to say that the development of the vampire stopped at this point, only that going forward, basically all depictions of the vampire were either based on Dracula or in some way functioned in response or relation to that book. Indeed, the 20th century saw new mediums such as cinema where vampires would continue to play an important role. Dracula was unofficially adapted to the big screen for the first time in the classic silent movie Nosferatu, which remains pretty spooky and creepy even 100 years later. But it was with the classic series of horror movies produced by Universal Studios from the 1930s onward that we got the most classic depiction of the Count. In Dracula from 1931, you get the most iconic performance of Bela Lugosi as the titular character, giving quite a unique and original interpretation that would prove incredibly lasting. Lugosi's Dracula is pale, stiff, speaks with a heavy accent, wears a dark cape and black slick hair. This was pretty distinct from Dracula as depicted in the original novel. Stoker's Dracula was, as we said, well-spoken and dressed in a fancy way. In most ways, he appears like any regular person, which hides the true monster beneath the surface. Lugosi's Dracula, on the other hand, let me put it this way, if you saw this guy on the street, you'd get pretty suspicious right away, wouldn't you? Regardless, it is Lugosi's depiction in the classic Universal movies that will become the image that most people associate with the character. To this day, when Dracula, or really any vampire, shows up in fiction, whether that be in video games or animated movies or whatever, it is usually based not only on Stoker's Dracula character in general, but particularly on Lugosi's interpretation of him.
Oh, greetings! It is I, the Count, and it's time to answer that fascinating question: what is the Sesame Street number of the day? Let's count the bats and find out.
The vampire, in short, can be so many different things and has played different roles for different people. It was an aspect of Eastern European folklore in the 18th century, spreading fear in communities that believed the creatures to be real. It was also a heated theological question that concerned thinkers from different denominations of Christianity, as well as Enlightenment thinkers and medical professionals that had to tackle and deal with the vampire and its characteristics from a scientific and rational standpoint, and they did so in various different ways. It also later came to play a prominent and important role in literature in Western Europe, especially in the UK and in the literature of Gothic Romanticism, reaching its culmination in Stoker's Dracula by the end of the 19th century and continuing to develop over the 20th and 21st, always with reference to all these old sources and stories. No creature or myth appears in a vacuum, but always as a result of prevailing ideas and traditions. In a religious sense, the vampire and its blood-sucking ways have clear religious connections too, in many ways essentially being an inversion of the Christian sacrament of the Eucharist, where the blood and flesh of Christ is, symbolically or not, consumed in church. This particular aspect of the vampire, I think, was especially well explored in Mike Flanagan's 2021 series, Midnight Mass, which is one of my favorite pieces of vampire media in a very long time. And that's an important thing to remember. The vampire is a creature that is always evolving and developing. Even though it's always, or at least mostly, based on all these old sources and classic traditions and folklore, there's an infinite amount of ways that the vampire can be shaped and formed according to a particular culture or time and place, certain, representing certain social anxieties and questions and cultural features. If you are a millennial, you'll remember the craze around vampires in movies like Twilight or The Vampire Diaries, which indeed presents a pretty radically different kind of vampire from the classic literature. Here, perhaps representing things like feelings of alienation and teenage angst. Being a teenager with all the awkwardness that often brings can make you feel like an outcast, or, and excuse the harsh language, like a monster or a vampire. This is a perfect example to see that the prevailing fiction in the culture will always be shaped and reshaped depending on the context of the times and the different anxieties in society. And of course, the vampire has, along with other characters like Frankenstein's monster, the werewolf, the mummy, and others, as ambassadors and recurring figures during the Halloween season, thanks in no little part to the many classic Universal movies. There simply isn't a Halloween without seeing a vampire inspired by Bela Lugosi's performance, or just basking in the gothic aesthetic that the vampire is so associated with. So whether you go to a Halloween party dressed as a vampire this year, or decide to watch one of those old classic movies, remember that you are participating in the shaping and reshaping of a creature and myth that is hundreds, maybe thousands of years old, depending on how you define a vampire. A creature and myth that has interacted with religion and theology, folklore, literature, arts, and science all throughout that history. The vampire is one of the most recognizable characters, especially during the spooky season, and it is one that is here to stay. Don't forget to go check out the companion video over on Esoterica. If this was a general introduction to the history of vampires, then Dr. Justin Sledge will be going deeper into that earliest period of the 18th century and all the vampire literature and stories about vampires that came out of that very earliest period, which is going to be so fascinating. So don't forget to go check out that video. And it is, once again, the spooky season, which we celebrate here on Let's Talk Religion by talking about all kinds of creatures and spooky things in general. And of course, we're going to do that this year as well. Previously, in the Shocktober series of videos, we've talked about all kinds of creatures, from jinn in Middle Eastern folklore to the good old vampire last year. But sometimes you just want to cozy up with a classic old-fashioned ghost. Perhaps the most common and famous of all the things that go bump in the night. Ghosts come in many different shapes and sizes and are, of course, shaped by the culture and context in which they appear. Ghost hunting has become a very popular genre here on YouTube and elsewhere recently, showing that there is still a huge interest around specters and spirits. But stories about ghosts go back far into history, and we find examples of them already in antiquity. With that said, have ghosts remained consistent throughout all of that history and across different cultures? What are ghosts, really? How can we define them and understand them? And can we trace a development of ghosts and our understanding of ghosts throughout history? That is precisely what we're going to be exploring in this episode. Because we all love the spooky season here on Religion Tube, as it is sometimes known, we're doing a sort of big collab for this whole month, where we're all going to be posting different spooky content, especially me, my colleague Dr. Justin Sledge on Esoterica, and Dr. Angela Puka on Angela's Symposium. So this is a whole festival this month, which we might call something like Religion Spook or Spooky Tube, perhaps. Regardless of the name, maybe you can leave comments on which name you prefer, or maybe a better name than those two. But for those interested in the spooky and the macabre and all these darker topics, go check out the videos that will be posted on their channels as well, Esoterica and Angelo Symposium, as well as more videos coming on this channel this month for the spooky season. I am very much looking forward to this. Everyone knows what a ghost is, right? I think we all get at least a similar image in our minds when we think about the word ghost, but things aren't necessarily that simple. The word ghost can have many different meanings and has been used in different ways across history. The roots of the word come from words like ghast in Old English, as well as other etymological cousins stretching back far into history. Earlier, the word and its cognates were used to denote the life force behind a thing, equivalent to things like the Greek pneuma and the Latin spiritus, or spirit. In many ways, this was kind of equivalent to the concept of the soul, that which animates and gives life to things. We can still see this older use of the word in the Holy Ghost of the Christian Trinity, sometimes also referred to as the Holy Spirit. As we can see that spirit and ghost is kind of synonymous in this way. But eventually, ghost came to be used to denote something different, something more frightening and peculiar. It wasn't just a spirit in the wider sense, but the spirit of someone diseased that returned to this world. This can be seen, for example, in the works of Shakespeare in the 16th and 17th century, such as in Hamlet, where a ghost plays an important part of the plot. Today, perhaps the most standard understanding of ghosts is that it is the spirit of a deceased person who has somehow returned to or lingered in the world of the living, and can be seen or in some way experienced by the people who still are alive. These can then also have certain recurring characteristics, such as being translucent and often pale. Often, people who experience a ghost will be maybe family members or friends of the deceased person that is haunting them, or the ghost in question has maybe been killed in an unjust way and is seeking vengeance, thus being a malevolent and vengeful ghost. It is this wider definition of ghost that we will be using in this episode. It is indeed a important and good question to consider whether we can actually use the word ghost to refer to all these different beings and stories across the world. Is the Japanese yurei the same as the European ghost, for example? These are questions that are worth asking ourselves. But I think that the experience of ghosts, as we understand them, are so universal and can be found across history and in so many different parts of the world, that we can justifiably talk about ghosts in this universal way, at least since we have defined it in this broader sense. And with this in mind, while the word ghost being used in the particular way that we know it today might not be that old, the reports, stories, and claimed experiences of these beings or spirits can be found going back thousands of years, and in a surprisingly wide array of geographical and cultural areas otherwise unconnected. All the way back in ancient Mesopotamia, there is the concept of the Yidin, or the Etimo, depending on if you're speaking Sumerian or Akkadian, as spirits of the dead who dwell in the netherworld called Irkalla, equivalent to the Hades in Hellenic religion. These spirits of the dead could also interact with the world of the living in different ways. It was expected of the family of the deceased to keep making offerings to them so as to make their stay in the underworld more bearable. But if they failed to do so, the ghost of the deceased could cause various troubles and illnesses. So just like in many other cultures that we will see, like in China, for example, revering or respecting the ancestors is very important. To give offerings in different ways to the dead could be an important factor in making sure that the afterlife of that person is a pleasant one. If you fail to do so, then there could be repercussions. Right? The ghost could come back and haunt you in different ways, could cause you misfortune, could cause you trouble. This is a common theme in many ancient and non-ancient cultures. The ancient Egyptians famously had a lot to say about death and what happens to us after we leave this life. The Egyptians may indeed have been some of the earliest to conceive of the soul as we understand it, but their idea of soul was quite different. Indeed, they believed that we have several different souls, or at least parts of the soul, perhaps, which survive after we die. There was the Ka, or vital essence, which stayed in the tomb after death and could be sustained through things like food and drink that was often left in the tomb. There was also the Ba, which is more so the personality of the person. The Ba was imagined as taking the form of a bird with a human head and could fly out of the tomb to the world of the afterlife and come back. There was also the Ach, an immortal transformed self. And so this Ach comes to be after the person has traversed, or the soul has traversed all these lands of the afterlife. Right? When it has reached this final stage, that is when the Ach comes to be. So the Ach is not present right now as I am alive. I don't have an Ach. That is an aspect of the soul that sort of develops after this journey through the underworld. The ideas of the Egyptian soul and afterlife are very complex, and in some instances, the Ba and Ka are reunited to animate the Ach, which then traverses the realms of the underworld or enters into the field of reeds. Famously, the soul of the deceased has to go through various trials and travel through dangerous realms after death, which is why the Egyptians left things like boats and weapons in their graves. This is also the origin of famous texts like the Book of the Dead, or more properly known as the Book of Coming Forth by Day, which was essentially a set of instructions, prayers, and spells meant to help the deceased person travel through the underworld. At some point, the soul comes to a kind of court ruled over by the god Anubis, where their heart will be weighed against the feather of Ma'at, which means order or justice on a scale. If their heart was heavier than the feather, it would be thrown to the terrifying Amit monster, which would eat it, condemning the soul to oblivion. But if the heart was lighter or equally light to the feather, the soul was allowed to enter into the paradisial field of reeds. Anyway, all this to say that the Egyptians also believed that the soul, particularly the Ach, could also return to the world of the living as a ghost. Perhaps, as we said, the family hadn't given them a proper burial, so they had to come back to right the wrong committed against them. Classic ghost stuff. And we actually have some famous ghost stories from ancient Egypt. One of them is called Funsenhab and the Ghost. It's a story either from the New or Middle Kingdom that tells the tale of a priest of Amun called Funsenhab, who has an encounter with the ghost. The beginning of the story is sadly lost, but judging from what happens after, it seems that he had some kind of ghostly experience when he was in the necropolis of Thebes. He suddenly encounters the ghost or spirit of someone who has been long deceased. When the story picks up, he's returning home, and once there, he summons the spirit again to inquire further about who he is and what he wants. Turns out he's the ghost of a man called Nebuchadnezzar. He's grieved by the fact that his tomb has deteriorated. The ground beneath it has collapsed, destroying it in the process. Now, as we know about ancient Egyptian beliefs about the dead, the state of the tomb and the offerings given are very important. And since Nebuchadnezzar's tomb has been destroyed, no one can find it anymore, and therefore they can't give any offerings. His spirit has thus become a restless ghost. The priest then promises that he will build a new tomb for Nebuchadnezzar, but the latter is skeptical. However, the priest sends his servants to find the ruined tomb and announces that he is going to build a new one. Sadly, just as with the opening, the ending of the story is also lost. But again, judging from the way the story seems to be going, we have to assume that Funsenhab follows through on his promise. This is what most people assume, at least. This is perhaps not that spooky of a ghost story, but it does tell us a lot about the way that the Egyptians viewed the afterlife and the way that spirits or ghosts function within that wider world view. There are also ghost encounters in the great epics of Homer. In one of the most famous and powerful sections from the Odyssey, Odysseus travels to Hades, the underworld, where he meets and converses with the ghosts or spirits of various people, from his mother in a very touching section, to his old allies in the Trojan War, like Achilles, Agamemnon, etc. Certainly these are ghosts that he is encountering in some way, but at the same time, it is Odysseus himself who has traveled to the underworld to meet them, and not the dead who have returned to the world of the living. So can they then be considered ghosts based on the definition that we've been using today? It's up to you to decide. But it is in the Hellenic and especially the later Roman world where we find some of the earliest examples of ghosts and ghost stories as we more commonly know them today. Ghosts were thought to roam the cemeteries and could come back to the world of the living to seek vengeance. The Roman philosopher and writer Apuleius wrote, "There is also another species of demons, according to a second signification, and this is the human soul, after it has performed its duties in the present life and quitted the body. I find that this is called in the ancient Latin language by the name of the lemur." One of the best examples of the ghost as it was understood in antiquity comes from an actual ghost story that seems to have been quite popular. The most famous version of this story was told by Pliny the Younger and is incredibly fascinating. Despite being 2,000 years old, this story feels strikingly modern in almost every way. The way the ghost is described, the mystery that unravels, and the solution and conclusion could all be taken straight from a modern ghost tale or scary movie. It roughly goes like this. In Athens, there was a large house that was thought to be haunted. The previous residents and neighbors claimed that strange noises could be heard in the house at night, particularly the sound of rattling chains which would come closer and closer. The rumors also said that eventually, if one dared to stay in the same room, a frightening ghostly apparition of an old man would appear. Now, a few years later, the house had been abandoned and had received a legendary status as a place haunted by ghosts. Eventually, a Stoic philosopher called Athenodorus comes to the city, and he sees that the house in question is selling at a very low price. This seemed suspicious to him, given how large and beautiful of a house it is, so he inquires about it, and he does find out about its ghostly, haunted story. Not persuaded by this, though, he still buys the house and prepares to stay his first night, sitting at a desk with a lamp, dedicating all his attention to his writing. Then he tells the rest of the story like this. The first part of the night passed with the usual silence. Then began the clanking of iron fetters. However, he neither lifted up his eyes nor laid down his pen, but closed his ears by concentrating his attention. The noise increased and advanced nearer, and it seemed at the door, and at last in the chamber. He looked round and saw the apparition exactly as it had been described to him. It stood before him, beckoning with a finger. Athenodorus made a sign with his hand that it should wait a minute, and bent again to his writing. But the ghost rattling its chains over his head as he wrote, he looked round and saw it beckoning as before. Upon this, he immediately took up his lamp and followed it. The ghost slowly stalked along as it encumbered with its chains, and having turned into the courtyard of the house, suddenly vanished. Athenodorus, being thus deserted, marked the spot with a handful of grass and leaves. The next day, he went to the magistrates and advised them to order that the spot be dug up. There they found bones commingled and intertwined with chains, for the body had molded away by long lying in the ground, leaving them bare and corroded by the fetters. The bones were collected and buried at the public expense, and after the ghost was thus duly laid, the house was haunted no more. A spooky example of an ancient ghost story that has many of the tropes that we find in similar ghost stories and scary movies today. The Middle East also has its fair share of spooky creatures and monsters that roam the deserts and oases. Most famously are, of course, the jinn and its subcategories like the Ifrit and the ghoul or ghoul. These are mysterious creatures that can be both good and bad and are commonly found in dark, abandoned places like cemeteries and old abandoned ruins. These can't really be called ghosts, though, because they're not these spirits of deceased human beings, rather being separate beings altogether. In fact, in the Islamic religion and culture, there is very little in terms of ghosts. The idea that those who have died can come back to this world isn't really something that is widely believed in, since it is believed that the dead go to another realm altogether, either the Barzakh or to paradise and hell, and they stay there. Now, that isn't to say that we don't find ghosts at all in this culture, but it is strikingly absent, especially given how common these ideas seem in other parts of the world. Because indeed, we can travel all the way over to East Asia, in places like China and Japan, and find a very vibrant and long-lived ghost culture. In China, there has traditionally been a very strong culture of ancestor veneration and worship. It is believed that the spirits of the dead live on somehow, that the bodily soul stays behind in this world, whereas the mental soul ascends to heaven. And on certain festivals and celebrations during the year, offerings will be made to the ancestors to keep them at peace. Within Taoism, it is believed that the shamans can communicate with the dead in different ways, and the veil between the world of the living and the dead is generally a bit thinner, you could say. This becomes perhaps especially apparent in one of the most popular festivals in East Asian culture, the Hungry Ghost Festival. This takes place on the 15th day of the 7th lunar month of the year, and it is believed that the gates of the underworld are opened and the ghosts return to this world to seek food and entertainment. There is a kind of sad aspect to this festival, because it is primarily ghosts who don't have any families, whose families didn't pay proper tribute to them after they died, or spirits that have done evil while they are alive that roam the world during this festival. These hungry ghosts are perpetually hungry, thirsty, and restless, doomed to wander and never be able to satiate their hunger. Quote, hungry ghosts were the spirits of those who had performed evil deeds in life and were condemned to wander as ghosts instead of moving on to a new life or to heaven. During this festival, families will light incense outside their houses, offer food to the wandering ghosts, again, often outside their houses so that the ghosts don't intrude inside the house, and Buddhist and Taoist officials will hold ceremonies to help the spirits and relieve their suffering. They can read sutras and perform different rituals in this way. The most visually famous aspect of this festival is also the lighting of lotus-shaped lanterns that are set afloat in the water. It is believed and hoped that the light from these lanterns will guide the lost souls to the afterlife. With a culture that is so infused with ancestors, ghosts, and spirits, there is of course a whole host of different ghost stories as well. Many of these are gathered in the classic collection called Strange Tales from a Chinese Studio, collected by a guy called Hu Songlin during the Qing Dynasty. Many of these stories have become very popular and famous. In one, the scholar Zhu, an Adair, sneaks into a local temple at night and steals the idol of a Judge Lu, which he returns home with. He then jokingly invites the dead judge to come drink with him. To his shock, the ghost of the judge actually shows up, but the story isn't as frightening as you might expect from a ghost story. The two actually become good friends, and the ghost helps Zhu with several things, albeit in slightly gruesome ways. Zhu wakes up one night to find the judge on top of him, opening up his chest. The judge explains that his bad riding is due to his weak heart, so he's replacing it with a new heart so that he can become a better scholar, a better writer. Later on, Zhu also asks the judge to do something about his wife's looks, who he doesn't think is very beautiful. He wants her to become more beautiful. However, the spirit goes ahead and straight replaces your whole head with another person. A strange but very intriguing story from the Chinese tradition of ghost stories. Japan also probably has some of the most famous ghost stories in the world. With the popularity of Japanese horror films and video games in the 21st century, the rest of the world has been exposed to their fascinating and unique ghost culture. In Japan, there are creatures or beings known as yokai. These are spirits or creatures that give character to basically anything that goes bump in the night that we can't explain. There are yokai representing various different things and concepts, somewhat similar to the kami of the Shinto religion. These yokai are often depicted as animal-like and can be quite colorful and interesting. Sometimes they are friendly and cute, and other times they are very frightening. But we can't really call them ghosts, at least not with the definition that we've been using today. For that, we instead have to look at what is known in Japanese as a yurei, often simply translated as a ghost. Yurei are the spirits of deceased human beings, usually ones that, for whatever reason, are unable to move on fully to the afterlife. Perhaps because they have been wronged in some way, or their death was especially gruesome or unfair. In Japanese yurei stories, these ghosts will often come back and haunt the person who did them wrong. And as in other cultures, there is often a moral message behind many of these stories. The yurei, while of course somewhat diverse, also has a very common classic appearance. Often, first of all, usually being a woman, usually with long black hair and a white dress, and usually also, at least in the older depictions, without any feet. These tropes can be clearly seen in many of the most famous examples of Japanese horror movies in the last couple of decades, such as in Ring or the Ju-on series. Telling these ghost stories, called kaidan, has been a major part of Japanese culture, especially since the Edo period. There was even a game developed during this period dedicated to telling ghost stories, called Hyaku Monogatari Kaidankai, where 100 candles would be lit at night, and the people present would take turns telling ghost stories. Blowing out the candle after each story was making the room increasingly darker with each candle. And the last candle was extinguished, it was believed that something or someone would be hiding in the darkness. So it was very sort of tense atmosphere as they tell these stories. We will be dedicating a full episode to the Japanese ghost stories and culture and the yurei later on this month, so stay tuned for that. Occasions like the Hungry Ghost Festival, of course, also reminds us of other similar practices around the world, such as All Souls Day. You can watch my episode on the history of Halloween for more information about that. And especially the so-called Dia de los Muertos, the Day of the Dead, celebrated primarily in Mexico and the Spanish-speaking Americas. This festival seems to be a kind of combination of the All Saints and All Souls Day festivals in Europe and all Aztec practices. During these days, it is believed that the spirits of the dead return to this world, and families do their best to remember and honor them in different ways, primarily through a kind of altar called an ofrenda, where things like food and drink will be offered. The fact that family members make an effort to actively remember the dead is what keeps them at peace in the afterlife, so to say. In Europe, ghosts continued to be popular during the Renaissance and Enlightenment periods, arguably becoming even more prominent in this period, especially with the emergence of what's known as Gothicism and the Gothic literature and aesthetic, which I believe that Justin has just covered in an episode of his channel. Definitely go check that out. This might be surprising to some, given that we perhaps associate these kinds of beliefs and ideas with superstition that belongs to a less enlightened age like the Middle Ages, where traditional religious beliefs were more influential. But how did actually Christianity, religion, and the church actually tackle the question of ghosts? Did it believe in them? What were they, and what was the stance of the church to these questions? Well, just like with our discussion of vampires and their origin, it could vary. The great medieval Catholic theologian and philosopher Thomas Aquinas definitely believed in ghosts, saying in his masterpiece, the Summa Theologica, that, quote, according to the disposition of divine providence, separated souls sometimes come forth from their abode and appear to men. It is also credible that this may occur sometimes to the damned, and that from man's instruction and intimidation they be permitted to appear to the living. He even claimed to have experienced ghostly visits himself, one time from his dead sister, who told him that she was in purgatory and needed him to pray for her. After he had done so for a while, she appeared to him again in Rome and told him that she was now in heaven. At another time, Thomas was visited by a friend and fellow Dominican, Brother Romanus, who told him that he had died recently, which Thomas apparently didn't know yet at that time. But others have greatly disagreed, however. The great reformer Martin Luther did not believe that ghosts were real. Instead, he argued that they are demons that take the form of deceased people to trick us. He says, therefore, we should know that all those ghosts and apparitions which are seen or heard, especially with rumbling and rattling, are not the souls of men, but surely devils, that are playing either at deceiving the people with false claims and lies, or at frightening and afflicting them in vain. So, from a religious standpoint, the answers have been many and varied. And some, outside of the religious sphere, even rejected the existence of ghosts and demons altogether, such as the Enlightenment philosopher Baruch Spinoza, who said, I have never read a trustworthy author who clearly showed that there are such things. Regardless, it is during the Enlightenment period that we see a flourishing of ghost accounts and stories in Europe, in places like Great Britain. There was the so-called drummer of Tedworth in the 17th century, where the magistrate John Mompesson had arrested a drummer and confiscated his instrument, after which he and his family were plagued by loud drumming noises and rapping in the house. In the early 18th century, the family of John Wesley in Lincolnshire also experienced strange noises, knockings, and even saw objects flying in the air. These kinds of hauntings, where no actual visual apparition was seen, but were limited to noises and other disturbances, gave birth to a new kind of ghost, often known as a poltergeist, which literally means something like a noisy ghost in German. But it is in the 19th century that some of the most recognizable aspects of modern ghosts and ghost encounters are born. This is not only through very important literary works such as Charles Dickens's A Christmas Tarot, published in 1843, and being perhaps the most famous ghost story in history, but also primarily for the movement known as spiritualism. Spiritualism was a belief system that emerged as part of the wider world of occultism and Western esotericism that was growing in popularity in the 1800s. At the core of this movement was the idea and belief that our individual awareness and person survives after death as a spirit, and that the spirits of the dead could be directly communicated with in different ways. Many point to the 18th century Swedish mystic, scientist, and theologian Emanuel Swedenborg as an important early influence on spiritualism. Being originally an aristocrat, inventor, and scientist, Swedenborg began having mystical visions and experiences later in life. Visions of the afterlife, heaven and hell, and the spirits in his life. Swedenborg wrote about these experiences and ideas in many writings and became a very popular and influential figure in the subsequent forms of esotericism in Europe and America, not to mention the unique form of Christianity that he founded. And the so-called spiritualism of the 19th century seems to be a part of his wider legacy. The essential characteristics of spiritualism, as we have said, is the idea that the spirits of the dead can be communicated with through different means. Thus, we see individuals claiming to be so-called mediums, someone with a special ability to perceive and communicate with spirits, often through rituals like the famous seance. There are many famous examples of mediums at this time, such as the often cited Fox sister. After experiencing strange occurrences and noises in their home, it was discovered the youngest sister, Kate, could directly communicate with the spirit. They would answer questions and requests, and they developed a technique where the spirit would be able to communicate directly by making tapping noises at appropriate letters of the alphabet as it was recited aloud. So the Fox sisters would recite the alphabet, so the A, B, C, D, etc., and then the ghost would make a tapping noise at a particular letter, right? And then they would start again, and the tapping would stop at another letter, and eventually they would have a full word or a phrase or sentence, right? So this is the way that they believe that this ghost would communicate with them. The Fox sisters became very famous. They would hold public seances around the country in America, and a lot of people came to see these spectacles. Eventually, however, it was revealed in different ways that the whole thing had been a hoax. The Fox sisters had been producing these knocking and tapping sounds by popping the joints in their feet, basically. But the popularity of these seances and spiritualism also meant that new mediums and similar people popped up all around America and Europe. People who would hold public seances, gather people who would come to see them, where they would claim to be able to communicate with dead relatives, etc. This became a huge boom in the late 19th and early 20th century. Many of these became equally famous, or even more so, than the Fox sisters, such as the Davenport brothers, who put on elaborate shows including spirit boxes, musical instruments, and a lot more. But a lot of people were also skeptical of these mediums and their activity. One of the more prominent of these skeptics was the famous illusionist and escape artist Harry Houdini, who would constantly and actively criticize and expose these spiritualists as frauds. And indeed, as these spiritualist movements continued to grow into the 20th century, the mediums came under increasing fire from a lot of critics. There were even research teams established with the express purpose of investigating these claims of supernatural powers and contact, and more and more of the mediums became exposed as hoaxes in different ways. Thus, by the mid-20th century, spiritualism had become significantly less popular, but its ideas and the popularity of ghosts had by no means disappeared. Indeed, as we can see, the spiritualist movement, even though it became a lot less popular, has hugely influenced the way that we talk about ghosts and hauntings today. Right? If you watch ghost hunting shows on TV or on YouTube, it's the same thing, right? The way that we use seances to contact ghosts, things like Ouija boards and other things, it all comes directly from the spiritualist movement, right? Ectoplasms, talking about ghosts as leftover energy, the whole lingo around the topic, it all owes a huge amount to the spiritualist movement, even though in itself it never died out, obviously, but it became significantly less popular by the mid 20th century. It survives in many different ways to this day through these different ghost hunting equipments and shows and just ways of conceptualizing this topic. But as we have seen, this is just one development in a much larger and longer story about ghosts that stretches throughout all of us, and which continues to develop and change even today. The 20th century was, of course, one where new mediums such as film had an enormous impact on the world, coupled with new revolutionary ways of communicating with each other around the world, sharing stories about spooky and unexplained encounters. We see very influential works of literature, like Shirley Jackson's The Haunting of Hill House, which depicts a group of individuals investigating a finite classic haunted house. Some of the most famous hauntings of the 19th century are those that were depicted in movies and other forms of media, such as the unexplained horror. Lutz family claimed to have experienced such intense supernatural activity in their house that they left suddenly one night after only living there for 28 days. There's also the famous case of the Enfield poltergeist in England in the late 1970s, when a family was terrorized by a ghost for years. The family claimed that furniture was moved around on its own, objects being thrown across the room, and that the daughters even levitated. And there are photographs that claim to capture this levitation happening. This famous haunting eventually became the basis for the second Conjuring movie in 2016. As technology and culture changes, so do, of course, our ghosts. And we see this clearly in the ghostly entertainment that we consume and create. With the advent of the internet, we see ghosts invading this space too, as depicted, for example, in the Japanese horror film Kairo, or Pulse, in 2001, where ghosts terrorize people and visit the living through the internet. This is probably one of the most unsettling films that I have ever seen, and it's highly recommended for anyone who can take the scares and that's interested in these kinds of topics. Later still, ghosts became part of social media with movie franchises like Unfriended, and we've seen the emergence of creepypasta culture, where scary stories are told on places like Reddit and 4chan, leading to all new urban legends about ghosts and monsters, like, for example, Slender Man. In the last few years, the genre of ghost hunting has become incredibly popular on YouTube, launching the careers of people like Simon Colby, BuzzFeed Unsolved, and Watcher with their Ghost Files series. Not to mention the many TV series on actual network television, also centered on ghost hunting in different ways, like Ghost Adventures. Does anyone remember Ghost Asylum and Ghost Brothers? Those were incredibly goofy. Anyway, I think it's safe to say that ghosts aren't going anywhere anytime soon. They've been part of the collective human experience for basically as long as we've had recorded history, regardless if they are quote-unquote real or not. And despite the fact that the way we understand and talk about them have changed in different ways. There's no denying there are few things as cozy as sitting down to listen to a good ghost story, and this is probably why it has survived for this long. It's been an essential part of the stories and tales that we tell ourselves and each other as people. Stories that help us connect with each other, but also which opens up conversations and contemplations about who we are, what matters to us, and perhaps most profoundly, what happens after we die. While ghost stories are often scary, they also bring a strange sense of comfort to a lot of people. Because even though the sudden sight of a ghostly figure will frighten us to our core, it simultaneously gives us some hope that there's something more waiting for us beyond the veil of death. Spooky season has officially started, and I'm very excited to be doing this wider project, Spooky Truth, along with my friends Dr. Justin Sledge. We'll be releasing different spooky videos, spooky content this month. So go subscribe to their channels if you haven't, and look forward to content on all these channels about topics like this. I found this exploration of ghosts a good entry point to the spooky season, to Spooky Truth, this year. As always, I just love doing these videos. It helps me get into the fall mood, the October mood, which I love so much.